One of the true architects of British popular music, Marty Wilde, is a performer-songwriter whose career began in 1957 and has now stretched across almost 7 decades. He first emerged during the original explosion of British rock and roll, becoming one of the country's first homegrown teen stars, with hits including Endless Sleep, Sea of Love, Bad Boy, and Johnny Rocco. At a time when Britain was discovering youth culture, Marty was right at the center of it, stylish, charismatic, and one of the defining faces of that era. But Marty Wilde's story goes far beyond those early hits. He became a major songwriter, co-writing chart successes such as Jesamine for the Casuals and Ice in the Sun for Status Quo, before helping launch another chapter of pop history through his own family. As father to Kim Wilde and Ricky Wilde, he co-wrote classics including Kids in America, Checkered Love, and Cambodia, making the Wilde name part of British chart life in more than one generation. Marty Wilde, this is an incredible pleasure. I mean, someone who has spanned the whole history of rock and roll.
Well, there aren't, put it this way, there aren't many of us left now, Steve. So I'm one of the few guys I think who's still around, still doing it. Or
yeah, and obviously it's kept you fit and lucid and clear, and not, I mean, that's an amazing feat in itself. I want to start with your own childhood. I'll come on to your latest album and the tour that's coming up a bit later, but I want to start with your childhood because I always feel the childhood informs of us, of the person, and just wondered what sort of household you grew up in, and was music really a part of your daily life?
Well, my early childhood was shaped obviously by the war. Most of the kids certainly would have been in my age group. Most were on the move after a while because I was fortunate in so much as with the war, most children were packed away to save them from the bombing effects and from being killed. So a lot of them were shipped away to different people around the country, which was quite an extraordinary thing, but that's what had to happen. And in my case, I was lucky because I'd been born when Hitler started his shenanigans. I was I think it was a couple of months old. So at the beginning of that war, I could stay with my mother. So my mother used to follow my father, and I used to follow my mother. So we went round different parts of the country because Dad was based in all over the place at one point, and then he started to settle down. We were in Devon for about a year and a half. I learned to swim there in Salcombe Bay, beautiful area. And then later on in the war, I went to Capel. I was the only English-speaking boy, and I think not the only English-speaking boy, but the only English boy in a Welsh school in Capel, which was a great joy in a way because the countryside out there is stunning. So that was that's what shaped my life, I think. I think the countryside shaped my life, and also the war. I was too young to be scared really, but because I can remember going into the Anderson shelters. I have a remarkable memory. The Anderson shelters during the war, which were provided by, I believe, by the government, which was like a big sheet of metal that you could bend. Well, it was put into the garden, and it was like a little house, but it was made of metal, and it saved you from being hit by shrapnel. But so I spent months, sometimes, a few months stuck in there, and it was a mixture really. It was a potpourri of experiences.
Was there music around though?
There was for me because I was. Don't ask me why. It was in me from a young age, and I remember in Capel school a lot of them were speaking Welsh, and so they gave me a tambourine and I could play a rhythm. They always sang, and goodness, I adored music since I was a very young child.
Did it provide an escape for you during that period during the war? Because whenever I talk to musicians, there's always they're always talking about music at a young age. For example, Elton John, about going into his room and hiding from the family and playing music, that sort of thing.
There was no fear in me. I mean, as I say, I can remember my mother rushing out to this shelter in the garden, and she stumbled. I remember that, and I can remember bombers and searchlights and doodlebugs, and the first they were the first drones. I saw several of those, about 3 or 4 doodlebugs. Some of them very, very, very close. But no fear. I didn't have a fear. The doodlebug you had a little bit, because you knew it could take you out very quickly. But other than that, no, I didn't. I mean, I wasn't reading news reports about how we were doing in the war front. So other people did. Obviously, my parents would have been worried over many times, but I was sheltered from it just basically because of my age.
It was probably after the war, but I saw an interview with you where you had said that your father brought classical records and he explained the beauty of music to you. What did he say to you about music?
He loved music too, and one of the things that he did, which was unusual for a man of his years in that time, I think music was in our family, because I've heard from some people that lived near my ancestors that there was always music at weekends. They would come out in the summertime, sit in their doorways and sing, because there was no radio hardly at all. Probably couldn't even afford a radio at that point. But my father used to harmonize, so all the songs came on, and he would sing the harmony, and of course that I picked up on that immediately. But I think it had to have been in me to have picked it up, because not everybody can sing harmonies, and I found it so easy as a child, learning from him really. And he was always singing around, and as I say, I think it was in the family, and of course then there was this great love of classical music and pop music, and which came obviously a little bit later in my life, but. It's always, music has played the most important thing in my life. It's my religion. I don't have a religion, and so because I don't have a religion, I've chosen music to be my thing.
Your father brought you a ukulele. What did you make of it, first of all? Was it to do with George Formby and that sort of era?
Well. Yeah, yes and no. One of the boys at school, a guy called Jimmy Monday, he brought a ukulele into the school and he started playing it. And I was very impressed. And I said, Jim, how do you play that? He said, well, it's dead easy. He said, you just run your fingers over like that down, he said, and put your little finger on there. He said, and that's G, or that's C, and so that's G. And I thought, well, I said, would you teach me? He said, yeah, I'll teach you. So then he taught me a few chords, which I didn't find difficult. And then, so I wanted a uke, and there was one in a pawn shop, which was in Trafalgar Road. It was called Pockets. And Pockets had this ukulele. It was a Keach ukulele, which was a good one as well. Keach was a good make of ukuleles. And it was hanging there. It was secondhand, obviously. And eventually, my father managed to get it for me. So I was fortunate.
In a sense, I always, feel like your generation was a really lucky generation to experience the advent of rock and roll, to go from that period before through when rock and roll really came through. I just wondered, what type of music did you listen to before, and what was the turning point for you?
Yeah, that's a very good observation from you, because a lot of people don't pick on that. I mean, I try to say this ginormous thing that happened in our life, like an explosion, and it was that, as you're saying, as what was it like before? It was all big band stuff. It was things like Billy Cotton Band Show. There would have been Duke Ellington from America. There would have been, and they were, don't get me wrong, they were wonderful musicians, particularly the Duke Ellington band was extraordinarily talented. And we had Billy Cotton Band Show, and and things like that. But lots of brass bands inspired by brass bands. But so that really was a lot of the music was pretty boring, really, in many ways for me. And I can remember listening to the Palm Court Hotel, which was a radio program which came on a Sunday. And so they used to put me to bed early of a Sunday because I had school. And they put the radio on for me. So I would listen to the radio, and it was always this Palm Court. And I could imagine all these people in Victorian dresses and, the men also with bow ties and dancing around, and all these, huge chandeliers and staircases. But I used to hate it. And I couldn't wait, when eventually radio started to come in bits and pieces. It was the radio where they went on the boats, and it was broadcast from the boats. I think it was Luxembourg or one of those, and they were. So that was the first sort of pop music that was getting into us, and that just preceded rock and roll. But rock and roll really came in, with the advent of people like Bill Haley in that film, The Blackboard Jungle, which was a film called The Blackboard Jungle. The theme music was Rock Around the Clock, and the thing that hit me like a ton of bricks was the rhythm. It was the rhythm. It wasn't Haley so much. Haley, yeah, that was good. That was and the record was an outstanding record, but it was the rhythm. It was this incredible rhythm. It'd been there all the time, really. It was the offbeat's been around for probably since time began, but it was this fusion of like blues and country music mixed in, which I think hit every young person around the world.
I mean, what was amazing about Blackpool Jungle is that there were reports in America for almost riots in the cinema when people saw that film. And this is sort of the advent of the teenager as a group. And I just wonder whether you just knew that you were then part of something much greater. And maybe this was also a reaction to being the child of war parents. My parents were in the war, and I always think there's there's often a reaction to, your parents' type of life and your own life. I don't know if that's relevant today, but it certainly was of our generations.
Well, I think it happened this way. I think the parents that were in the war, the men and women that were in the war that had children, when the war finished, I think that they eased back. And it was that easing back which gave us a bit of fresh air, because, my parents had been brought up with Victorian influences, which were quite severe, quite strict. Yeah, they were severe, very severe, and strict, very strict. You did exactly as your parents told you. And I think in my way was some of those things came through with me, some of that influence. I remember when I first went to work, I had to help my parents. Didn't keep that money. Most of that money went to my parents. You gave them, it was, I think I earned about £2.50 or whatever it was in those days. And then you would be left with probably about 3 shillings, half a crown or something, whatever it was in those days. A small percentage of because you gave that money to your mum and dad. That was what you gave to them. You were, helping them. It was your way of helping, and it was we all did it. And you were expected to as well.
Do you remember the first time you heard Elvis or saw Elvis?
I can, and I wasn't all that impressed. It was Heartbreak Hotel. It was intriguing because there was all this publicity was coming from America, but it didn't hit me. His voice didn't hit me at that one point, but it stayed with me, obviously, because of the publicity he was getting, and he was a young guy, so it was something I could latch onto as a young 16-year-old. But it was the album, and I got the album by pure chance. it was one of the guys. We had a little skiffle group at the time, and I was the leader of it. And one of the guys went. He said, "I've got an album." He said, "It's not really my cup of tea. Would you like to buy it?" So I said, "Well," he said, "It's Elvis. This new guy." So I said, "Well, what do you want for it?" So he said, 17 and 6. And I said, "Okay, I'll buy it." And of course, that was the album totally changed my life. It was like suddenly, 1,000 lights going on all around me. It hit me like a ton of bricks. He was the blueprint. He was a blueprint for success for so many young men. The way he dressed, the way he moved, the way he sung, the songs he sung, the style, having a group, guitars.
Were your parents supportive at a young age? Because your break came when you were still young. I think you were around about 17 when you started making moves. And I just wondered how supportive your parents were, because it is a generation where, and if I look at my parents' generation, they would say to me, be careful about doing something creative. You need to earn money.
Yeah, no, I was lucky that way. I was lucky. I had a job. Obviously, I was a messenger boy, traveling up from the south, from Blackheath up to London every damn day, and I loathed it. But no, they never they did get in my way, and I was very, very lucky, because Tommy Steele's manager, whose name was Larry Parnes, came to my home without me even knowing and wanted to sign me up. He'd heard about me, and that was it. That's when my sort of pop career really began. Other than that, I don't know what I would have done in life, but it would have always been something to do with music. But when Larry signed me up, being Tommy Steele's manager, he had that colossal power, which helped me, immeasurably as a starting singer.
There's this fascinating story about you that your grandmother predicted that you would be famous and travel the world, but that was at 6 months, when you were 6 months old.
Yeah, that's correct. That's absolutely correct. Yeah, it was a strange thing, all that. I mean, it's happened to me several times, though, with people. Some things in life you cannot explain. Like, she said these things about me, which eventually came true. She told a lady as well that there was a young girl who was used to pester her, said, Gran, come on, tell me my fortune. And she wouldn't. She said, "No, I don't want to tell. Tell me my fortune." We're badgered and badgered. And this was before the war. This was the very beginning of the war. And she said, "Well," she said, I didn't want to tell you this. If you're going to, your marriage won't last. It's not going to last. And I got to tell you that you've been on to me all this time. Your marriage is not going to last. I don't think it will. And I see you working in a white building." She said, "It has big pillars, big white pillars." She said, "And it's you're working there. I know you're working there." And of course, then later, the lady said she realised started to work in the Greenwich Naval College, which has these big white pillars, which is a beautiful building in Greenwich Park, or near Greenwich Park. And she was working there, and suddenly dawned on her what my granny had said. And our marriage did fail. Whether or not, one could argue that influence. But one of the things that happened to me, which was uncanny, was there was a friend of mine who wanted to get in the RAF. I used to go to church, and I was praying like crazy that he would get into the RAF. He was my mate, and I wanted him to do well. And anyway, one day his mother said, a lady at my work who tells fortune, she said she's said there's a tall guy who's been praying that my Phil gets into the RAF. So I said, so? So she said, "Well, you're a tall guy." She said, "Is it you?" So I said, "Oh, no, I don't do that kind of thing." But it was. How did that happen? Someone tell me. I cannot explain it, and no one can. Some things in life you just can't explain.
Now, your contemporaries and yourself, like Billy Fury, Cliff Richard, in at the start, I presume you sort of did orient yourself to the American rock and rollers, but what were the differences in your mind between you and the Americans?
Well, they were better. They were better, but they when Elvis was a young guy, he was listening to black music, and he lived near Beale Street. All this music, black music, influences in church music, gospel. We had to feel our way, and it was in stages. I mean, later on, people would say, well, people, like for example, the Beatles or groups like that were far more advanced, and they had all these influences I didn't have. The shop owner said to me one day, he said, do you like Elvis singing Hound Dog? So I said, yeah. He said, it's not the original. So I said, it's not the original. He said, no, black lady, and she's singing it. He said, you should get it. And I remember it was on the Vogue label, which I think was the French label at the time or whatever. But I bought the 78. He would bombard me with lots of wonderful black blues artists from the very beginning. I had to learn it quickly as well. Because we were singing like British singers when we first started off almost. But then this blues element came into our lives and it changed everything.
It took a few singles before you became successful, but then you became, incredibly successful. And I just wondered how your life changed at that point, and if you feel, looking back, you changed.
Yeah, I'm sure it did change me. But there again, I always treated it as a totally natural thing. Like I'd been signed up by this top manager, and I don't think it changed me. It didn't change me a great deal. It never really has, because I kept my feet on the ground. I never thought that I was the most wonderful thing in the world. To me, it was a job that I adored, but it was a job, and it was a totally natural thing. It wasn't me. So I accepted it. It was like, a total acceptance of a completely new way of life. And it's as though I was born for it almost, because suddenly I was just at that age meeting, young people, girls and new friends, and listening to such wonderful artists from America. But as I say, for me, it was a natural thing that I was doing a job which I felt I'd been born for. I never thought about it, but when I look back on it, I was born for it. I know I was.
I've read that you felt a lack of self-esteem at school, and that you'd said, I don't know if it was at the same time, but you said that you didn't like your voice and you didn't like your face. And I just wondered, sometimes fame can make those insecurities bigger, but for you, was it something that gave you self-esteem then?
To a certain extent, it did, but only for maybe just a little. Initially, when you first get success, that really does hit you, and anyone would be foolish not to think so, or wouldn't be telling the truth if they said it didn't affect them. But yes, it did affect me for a very short period of time, probably about 3 weeks, I would think, as far as, you're watching your record climb up for the first time, which was Endless Sleep, and it was really selling. And that was the time when I started to feel really much better about myself. But I'd always had been a lad of insecurities, really. I was a very tall guy, and it kind of set me up. I always felt set apart from some of the others. I was always 6 feet. I was always about 6'3", and I can remember going up in the train when I used to work. Standing in the train, and because you couldn't get a seat most of the times, by the time I got on the train, and I'd be heading up to London, standing there holding a strap so they didn't rock about too much in the carriageway. And I used to feel absolutely out of it. I just felt an absolute idiot because I was tall and rangy, and these things. Maybe when I was started, I might have looked in the mirror a bit more often, because you have to, because you're working on stage. But for me, it's a job. It's a job I absolutely adore.
I mean, one of the things that your career went in parallel with was, in a sense, on the advent of television and music on television, shows like Oh Boy and the 6-5 Special.
Yeah.
How aware were you of them being motors in your success? Could you actually sort of go out the next day after a show had been shown on TV and really see a difference?
Only when, yeah, to a certain extent, but only really when you did when you were part of a show. I mean, I was there when we were doing one of the TV shows. It was the Oh Boy show. It was in London, and they used to get out of the theatre because it was a big audience of young teenagers. So that to get you out, there was always a back entrance or some entrance. They might be able to get you out, and then you had to dash out to your car, and then I used to speed home, and then I mean I used to go to the fish and chip shop on the way home, and then I get that, stick it in the car, head home to my mum, and mum would say, "How did it go? You know, how did the show?" And I say, "Oh, it was," and she would have seen it because most of them were live. And did you enjoy yourself? Yes, I did, Mum, and it was great. And that was it. Eating fish and chips. It was kind of a sort of pretty basic. Maybe it was not like America. We weren't like America. America was slightly different, and of course that got amplified later on when you got someone like. Well, I'm just trying to think of a big name, not other Michael Jackson, for example, who my daughter toured with. I mean, that guy was colossal, almost phenomenal, and he would have been affected, and he was affected. And you know, it's a shame, but and the same for poor old Elvis. You know, for me, I was fortunate. I didn't have such a big career as Cliff was having, but I was glad about that in a way. It gave me time to be sometimes with my mates, or you know, to relax down a bit instead of being pointed at in the street. I mean, I used to get that, sure, but it wasn't as intense as artists that came along later had. I mean, Michael Jackson and Elvis. You cannot live a normal life when you're living that kind of life. You can't. It's impossible. Not where every girl is looking at you all the time and going, "Oh," you know, and every woman's looking at you all the time and going, "Oh, that is going to affect you." And any hot-blooded man who says that doesn't affect him is a liar.
I mean, one of the things, you know, to go with that aspect is that many artists aren't allowed to have a wife and a family life and settle down. But you met your wife when you were quite young, and you married young.
I did.
Was there any sense that might affect your career negatively?
Oh, no, we knew it would. We had a meeting about it. I told my manager I wanted to get married. He said, "Well, you realize if you do," he said, your career is going to be hit very badly. But we literally had a meeting in an office over it. And I said, "Well, that's what's going to happen. I'm getting married." So he said, "Okay, well, as long as you know." And I did know. And of course, things did change greatly for me. But for me, it was obviously something I needed in my life at the time. I needed someone like that. I needed someone like my wife, and who was just this beautiful thing had come into my life. This beautiful girl. I'd had girls before that I'd been out with, but this was different, and it was a completely different feeling. And it was for me, and the family. That was I was still making music and making records, but obviously they weren't as successful as they had been previously. But eventually, of course, that changed as the years rolled by, and then I started to come back, and it kind of balanced out in the end. And I had the advantage of having a young family around me. My family is a strong family, and so that was my. I never thought about it at the time, but I think it was the way I wanted to go, and it was a very fortunate and lucky thing for me to have this family around me, and growing, have children growing up with me. I wasn't always the best dad because I was always, I don't know, very quite self-centered dad, I suppose, like so many artists are in many ways, and I was always working, but I gave them music. I gave them that gift of music. They've all got it, and thankfully they have.
Was that an organic process in the family, the music? Because it's, if both parents, and your wife was in the Vernon sisters, so both parents are musical. They understand, or they've had experience of the industry, let's put it that way. And I just wondered then, was that a conscious thing to bring music in your children's lives, or was it something that just happened organically?
No, it was organically is a good word, I guess. It was just absolutely natural. You know, I used to have these big speakers. I didn't have like small speakers, and I didn't have like little radio things. I had big speakers in the room, and I had two of them, Wharfdales they were, and I used to I had a quad amplifier, and I used to turn up full bass, full bass. I love the bass, and I loved to be a little bit edgy, so a little bit top, full bass, full top, and let it blast out. And so my children grew up with sometimes it might be classical music, but mostly it would have been pop music. It would have been any record that came along at the time that I loved, and because my tastes were quite varied. When the Beatles came along, I love the Beatles, and I love classical music. And as each artist came along, by and large, and when synthesizer music came in, I loved synths. I loved it from the very beginning, and still do. I love synthesizers. I love what they can do, and so yeah, it was organic, I guess. It was a good way of putting it. It was absolutely natural. Of course, it's been the same really for some of my children. I mean, Kim's daughter and son, but you know, Harry's in the industry, and not so much Rosie. She's going to be a doctor of some kind, but has a fabulous voice. She really, not just saying that, she has a fabulous voice, and he is extremely talented guitarist. So yeah, it's organic.
When your career changed and you started becoming a songwriter, I just wondered, did you do that out of necessity, or was that a choice?
It was a necessity when I wrote Bad Boy. I was fed up with singing covers all the time. I was having great success, you know. I'd Sea of Love, Donna, Teenager in Love, all these things were coming along, but I wanted to have an original thing. So I started to write. I got Bad Boy. I wrote, it was going to be the B-side, but they turned it over, and unfortunately, and that was my first self-penned hit. And to be honest, truthful with you, it was a necessity. And it wasn't until later in my life, until in the 70s, the mid-60s, I started to realize that I was writing much more. And I was writing in obviously, but because I had so much work, that stopped me from spending time writing. And that was one of the downfalls of working, of being to be a star. You know, you had to keep working. Really, I should have spent time writing. But in the end, I sort of caught up with it. And in the 70s, I started to get hits, you know, hits I'd written. And that's carried on really right the way through, carried on through the 80s with Kim. It's carried on now to the point in time where I am now. So
something you said earlier, which really intrigued me, was when you were very young, listening to the radio, and you sort of visualized what you were hearing. When you write, are you visualizing the sound, the music, how it appears? Is there some sort of image going on in your head as well?
The image would be, most of my songs are plays. They're like a play to me, like watching a film. When I was writing Cambodia, I was flying the damn plane. You know, I was in the room when the guy was searching her face to see if she knew what terrible things he was doing. I could see the whole damn thing, and it's I wrote a song about Eddie Cochran, and again I was right in there, just watching Eddie in my head, and do I get? Yeah, I've always been arranging. I've arranged most of my songs myself. I've always had a huge influence in the arrangement. Not in. I'd say 90% of my music were my arrangements, influences. Because if I couldn't write it, which I couldn't, obviously, some of the technical side, I go through it with the writer to go right through. I want this bass part. I want this. I want the guitar there. I want that. And that carried on right the way through my career. I've just always had ideas. I'm an ideas man. Don't ask me. I don't know why.
I mean, you mentioned Cambodia, but of course, Kids in America was Kim's, breakthrough, massive hits that you and Ricky wrote together.
Sure.
But Kim it was an odd start, really, wasn't it? Because it wasn't Kim who was sort of at the forefront or going to be the front person.
And literally, Rick had this little baby synth, and he was tapping out this melody line. And then that's when Kids in America said, "Oh, we'll do this," and then Kim recorded it. And of course, that hit us right out of the blue, because I thought when we first recorded it, we took it to Rack Records and Mickey Most, and Mickey said to me, "What do you think of this song? Where do you think it'll get?" I said, "Well, I think Kids in America could make the top 50." He said, "I think it could make the top 3. That's the difference between you and I," he said. So I said, "Well, I hope you're right." And of course, he was right. But eventually, Kim started to play a much bigger part as time was moving on. And she started to get involved and she's written several hits herself. So, quite a few hits. So, she eventually, she caught up with us. But initially it was Rick and I writing out these songs. But again, with Kids in America, that was a play in my head. I could see this girl looking out this window and all the traffic, flashing by down below, and a very hot. I can imagine a hot night, and she says, "I think I head downtown," and she goes downtown, meets this guy. But one of the things which made me, which still makes me smile, is that when I wrote this as the girl was in charge. It wasn't some subservient girl. This was a girl who was in charge, telling me, don't check on your watch, don't you look at the time. This is my life, and you're going to be part of it. You win or you go. You are or you're not. So it was one of the early sort of songs, in a way. I think it was for a woman to sing, for a girl to sing.
That song, it took a year to be released, I understand. So I just wonder whether Kim developed into that character in that year, because as I understand, because she would have been your little girl, I don't know if you saw her as that when you were writing it.
No, I didn't have a clue. No, she had short hair. Her hair was much shorter. No, she always had lovely features. She was a beautifully featured girl, but no, she was just my Kim. That's simple as that. It wasn't until one day, I can remember exactly when it changed. And I came in. I walked into the kitchen and she was on the phone, and suddenly I looked at her for the first time, because I watched her making this phone call, and I suddenly looked at her. I thought, my God, this is my daughter. She'd just gone in the charts with this record, and I thought, my goodness me, how you've changed, how you've. This is my daughter. How strange. And strangely enough, I said, and about 2 years before this happened, I said, they asked me what did they think of what was going to happen in the future with music. And I said, well, I think on the pop side, I said, I could see a guy who was rather like Elvis, doing an Elvis type thing in a big, big way, and being a big star doing this Elvis thing. I said, and I also see a girl, I say, she's like a Bardo. She's like a Bridget Bardo with blonde hair. I said, I can see this girl. He said, and they said, these stars are going to be in the future. I said, that's what I believe. I said, I think someone like an Elvis type character, which transpired. Shaky Stevens came along, and sure enough, Kim came along. And those two things, don't ask me why. That's what I saw in my head. The only thing I didn't envisage was boy bands, where you've got about 12 guys all singing or 6 guys all singing. And I never thought I'd see a day like that.
I want to get on to the present because Rage to Love was a song that was written for Kim originally.
Sure.
And it's become your latest single. So can you tell me about the writing of it originally and why you decided now to record that yourself?
Well, this is a complete lyric change, and I wasn't. It was written. It was written for Kim, but it was a girl talking about girls, and but I'd always loved the melody line, and I thought one of these days I'll come back to it. I'll come back and I'll do something with that. And it wasn't until my wife said, "Why don't you start? Why don't you make a rock and roll out? Sing some rock and roll again." That I thought about it, and I thought, well, what am I going to sing? What kind of style? And I thought, well, you always love a Rage to Love. Why don't you write a lyric that is about about rock and roll and about dancing? Because it was always a rock and roll song, and I played a part in the arrangement of that song, and it was a shooby dooby doo doo doo, but it was one of those, and I had this. And in the lyric line, I'd said about this guy who walks, the compere walks on the stage and says, okay, sing it, girls, start it up. And then the girls and the band, everything. And I thought, yeah, that's what it. And I'd been to a rock and roll show about a year and a half ago, where they were closing the venue, and so all the rock and rollers they couldn't be able to ever go back to this place, and I felt so sorry for them because I'd done a show that night. I'd sung a show, been part of a show rather, and Darrel Higham, who I worked with on my latest album, he was there that night playing in a different band, but we were talking together that night, and I thought, I know what I'm going to write about. I'm going to write about dancing. I'm going to want to write about, let's get people out there again dancing. Let's get rock and rollers out there, and that's what I tried to get across in the latest lyric. It wasn't about girls. It was about guys talking and saying, right, what we're going to do. It's like all dressed up and nowhere to go. Every weekend they get their gear, their teddy gear, their great gear that they wear, and the rock and roll boys, the rockabillys. And I thought, that's what you're going to write about. You write about them going to the venue. And what a great joy, what a phenomenal joy the song gives you, because it's always given me a kick. And so I tried to get that in the lyric. That's what I tried.
And you mentioned the 3 generations of the family, and they're on this, aren't they?
My granddaughter's on it. Yeah, she is. My granddaughter's on it. That's all. There's only one. My granddaughter Rose is on it. That's Kim's daughter. She has a doctorate, so she's got a completely different career in mind. But she did the doobie doo up. She goes, "You got a brilliant voice anyway, like a mama, Normally I would have been Kim doing that, but Kim did the original on her own record, Rage to Love, but Rose, it's ironic, isn't it, really? Rose, her daughter, just doing the backing vocals on this latest record, so which I'm very proud of because I like the record, so that's something.
I mean, you've worked together with Kim, Roxanne, and Ricky, and I just wondered who's in charge when you work with them.
Well, I don't work with Rick anymore, but when we were together, I would have said Ricky was possibly more in charge in many ways than I was, because he would be in an A&R sense, but I was always there as a backup, and also with ideas on which way the instrumentation should go and what kind of thing. But with the exception of You Keep Me Hanging On, which was all Ricky, which I think was brilliant. But by and large, we were a partnership, and we shared things. I'd say to him, I remember once it was one of the songs where I heard a chord, which was a very different chord to what it wasn't in the same key, and it was a weird chord. I said, I hear this chord, and we played it on the thing. He said, yeah, we could change that. That would be the middle eight. I said, right, brilliant. And it is I won't say other song, but it's got a weird. Suddenly it comes in, and you can, So it was something I played a part in. So, but we were a partnership.
Why do you think it's those partnerships within the family have worked so well when many people, I'm going to speak from my own personal perspective, that I couldn't imagine working with anyone in my family that we would end up having a nightmare row and probably not get through it.
Yeah, well, I think we've always been pretty close family, so we've not always been in agreement, but by and large, we just got on with things, and I also Kim is I mean, we're talking about teamwork. We were a team, all of us, and Kim as well. Kim put huge input. And I remember with when we needed a follow up to Kids in America, and when you get another record that's been that big, it's so damn hard to come up with. And Rick had come up with this great melody line, and I thought about it, and I thought, right, I'm going to call this Laser Love. You go da 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 Laser Love. I thought, right, I know what we're going to do. So it's Laser Love, and I wrote all the lyrics with Laser Love. And Kim heard it, and she said, Laser Love? I said, yeah. I said, no, I don't like that. Said, checkered love. I said, yeah. I said, oh, I love it. I said, yeah. I said, checkered, it's a rhythm. Checkered love, checkered love, checkered love. Brilliant girl. And of course, she wrote for the lyrics for You Came and Never Trust a Stranger, and all those tracks, wonderful tracks. And she's a very good lyricist. She could probably have written a lot of these songs just on her own, maybe. I don't know. But Cambodia was mine. That was my idea. So Cambodia was a really weird one because we had this very catchy backing. It was like a pop thing, and all I was seeing was this really serious thing of a guy who was flying clandestine journeys, and doing work for the CIA, and going across into Cambodia, and he eventually gets killed. So it's just funny how things turn out.
I want to touch on some of the other artists that you work with, because one of the most, well, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful songs ever written is Jesamine, and it's the Casuals had a massive hit with that. And how did that Ronnie Scott collaboration come about?
Well, I can tell you exactly. I'd written, what can you say? All those bits, everything had been done in that. Not all the lyrics, but most of the lyrics. But it wasn't finished. And I had no idea. I'd know which way it was gonna finish up. And I played it to Ron, and I knew, because I played it on keyboards, it was in C. And it had such a lot of beauty in it, the song. And I thought, well, this song will never get anywhere in life. But Marty, it's your little melody line, and it's beautiful. So stick with it. So we had it, but it wasn't finished. So Ron heard it, and he said, okay. He said, I got it. Wait a minute. He said, so he goes, what can you say? So far away. She's too far away. When Jesamine goes, a part of me knows. Oh, yeah. I'd written, when Jesamine goes, a part of me knows I'm not really living, a butterfly child, so free and so wild and so full of living. And he said, when Jesamine stays, those guys, what about that? I said, that sounds good. And that was it. And that was the part. But that was as important part as though I'd written most of that song, 3/4 of it. That was the part that set it up as well. So, that's where you view when you're writing with someone. Sometimes they might come in with, like Kim with Checkered Love. She played a big part in that track just by giving me a great title, a much rhythmic title, and he played a part in coming in that when Jesamine stays, though time goes fast. I had all the other chants. What can you say? when I go. I had all that, so it was just. But he was the thing that lit the fuse.
One thing I read, and it sort of just ties in with this, and because when people contribute, they can own part of the publishing. One thing that your wife recommended you to do early on was to make sure you kept the publishing. How important was that?
Oh, phenomenal. I mean, we've made our money. We've made I never made money on the road. Very rarely. No, you make money, but it's not the end of the world. I was never a big stadium filler, so it was never going to be that kind of a huge input. But music has been our money. Right? We have money we have royalty rates every year. Which some are quite huge. So that it's been music. It's been writing songs that. And it was my wife's. I was going to sign up, and my wife said, "No, don't do that." So, because I'd had a couple of, we're just about to go in the charts. She said, "No, don't sign with anyone. Hold off." And I said, "Oh, okay." And she was the influence for that, and so she literally run our business from that day forward, literally. Because we knew about publishing companies and all that, because I'd worked for them for a few years before, doing things before these hits came along, and so yeah, I mean, and also she said when we had a hit with Kids in America, because we had a publishing deal with RAC, which was a good one. We're obviously going to make money. And she said, right. She said, we're going to have our own studio now, a recording studio. I said, oh, a recording studio. I said, oh, don't get one of those damn things. I will be slumbered with it. She said, no, you won't. She said, you'll be writing. And she said, and we're going to have our own studio. So when Kim's career came along, eventually after Kids in America, after that first album, all the rest of those albums were most of them were cut in our own studios in Nebworth and in Hertfordshire. So that was where we were making albums, a third or a quarter of the price that the other artists were making. We were making money, and we had all that royalties coming in and only paying about a quarter of what they were paying, and that was all down to my wife. My wife's, and she still handles that. It was her that said, why don't you sing rock and roll again? Make a rock and roll album. And I thought, okay, her don't ask me why, but her intuition is incredible.
So tell me a bit more about the album and what you've written for it.
It's an album. I met Darrel Higham, and Darrel Higham is a rockabilly guitarist, and he'd been coming to see my shows, and I know that he'd worked with Imelda May and Jeff Beck and people like that. But he always just came along just to watch my shows, and he was a fan in a nice way. And I never took much notice until when Joyce said rock and roll, and I thought, if I was going to make an album, a rock and roll album, I'd like to make it with Darrel. And he's a big fella. He's tall like me. He's almost like a brother in a strange kind of way. And we hit it off. Most of our time we spend talking, which is ridiculous, really. We talk politics, and in between we work. But on the album, it just worked out. It was like a hand in a glove. I said, we're going to do Rage to Love. Have you heard that? He said, no, I haven't really heard it. And I played him the track with Kim's track, and he said, that's fantastic. I said, well, I got a new lyric. I'm going to write a new lyric for it. And so we got that track done, and then of course we started to do all the other tracks, because we realized after 4 tracks, we sent 4 tracks to Cherry Red, and they accepted an album on just on those 4 tracks. And I had a really confident feeling, which I've never felt before, about the tracks that we were doing. I just felt we were on the right road, and I was really enjoying it. And so was he. and we did, and it shines in the album. I mean, and a wonderful thing is when you're working with someone as talented as he is, that I would we do the rhythm section in one of these studios, and then I'd give him the guideline, the vocal, and then I'd say, okay, we'll leave it with you. He would then lay down his guitar tracks, whatever he wanted to lay. And every time I ever listened to him, they were wonderful. He just came up with all these guitar lines. And so then I thought, well, I'll try and influence him. I'm trying to get him to play lots of, not different style, but slightly different, so he can tackle different things without straying too much from his rockabilly roots. And so that's what we tried on this album, and I think it comes off, and it's an album I really am proud of. I mean, it's a sort of album, and the track that we've got as a single, if it doesn't sell, whatever happens, in the old days I used to worry about it. In this day and age with this album, I'm just proud of it. I'm proud of it as an album, and not, a couple of the tracks I might say, well, they might have done that better, or myself personally, not Darrel. But the energy and everything is on that album. It's in that rockabilly feel. I wanted to do what Dave Edmunds was doing with Girls Talk. He took an Elvis Costello track, turned it into rock and roll virtually, and I thought that's what I want to do. And I've always said rockabilly artists should get, or rockabilly players should try and get some contemporary writers to write. Keep your rhythm, keep the rockabilly feel with double bass and that lovely beat, and it's a lot of the guitar phrasing, but move it on, try and move it on to a few other things. And that's what we've done on this album. And we've succeeded in doing, I would say, certainly on 3 or 4 of those tracks of the album, we've moved on. We've moved on from just being pure rockabilly sort of sound.
And you've announced some dates where you'll be on, I presume it will be part of a tour later in the year. What can people expect in terms of the range of material that you will play on stage?
I don't know yet. I mean, I don't know what we're going to do. We've been I have a band already, the Wildcats, and I work with them, and I have been working for the last, oh my gosh, the last 37, 38 years, or most of them been with me that period of time. So we've been a close net group and a very lovely group, but they're not rockabillys, you know what I'm saying? My band know that. Their style of music is just slightly different, although they love rock and roll, but it's not as rockabilly influenced as Darrel's and the Enforcers is. So I shall probably I'm going to stay with the Wildcats, but also at some point I will definitely do some shows with Darrel. Definitely. I don't know what we're going to do yet, but I might just turn up at a rock and roll venue with him and the boys, and we'll just do some shows like that. I'd be up for that.
I just want to ask you, do you see your legacy more in your own work or in what your children have achieved?
I don't know. I think it's a balance of the two, really. I think that obviously I've been a very big influence in their lives, but then they've taken that over and they've done, they've maintained it themselves. They've got their own. They've had their own success in separate from me in many ways. So it was kind of, again, teamwork. It was a team thing, team effort.
And lastly, I mean, you chose love over fame to a certain extent, by getting married and
Sure.
And risking a level of fame. Has family ultimately been more important than fame?
Yeah, I guess it was really always in the background. I've always been I suppose, self-centered devil in many, many ways, and I think they know that, and they put up with it to a certain extent. It's always been me to a certain extent, and they come along, bless them. They've put up with me. Even today, I'm like that, and my Kim just looks at me and gives me a smile. She knows me backwards. And my wife does, but the family, the family to me, it's kind of, it's a root thing. It's they support me. they're kind of they're like an armchair I can sit in and rest. They're like when I'm, I know, sometimes, for example, I can, in a family sense, I fell over this morning. This morning I was in my bathroom, and I went to stand on the scales to weigh myself because I'm getting big, and I slipped and I fell backwards, and I grabbed this hot water pipe and pulled it. Oh my God! And fell on my backside, and I thought, oh my God, because I pulled it out of its socket, and I thought, oh well, thank God I'll call Marty. So it's one of the bonuses is I called my second oldest son. I said, Mark, you've got to come round and help. Marty too, I called. I said, you've got to come round and help me. So he's coming tonight. So we are a kind of, it's kind of all those things that I seemingly gave up. I've had rich rewards, not just fixing my pipes, but fixing my life. They've been a fantastic part of it, wonderful part.
Well, Marty Wilde, it's been really wonderful to talk to you, and I want to thank you in the end because you've had such an incredible contribution to music over the years, and I think sometimes we forget to thank the people who have contributed to the culture within our lives. So thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Well, I'll thank you because I can say this from the bottom of my heart. You've asked some of the most intelligent questions that anyone's asked me in a long, long time. So thanks for that, Steve. You got the best out of me. I mean, you've got the truth out of me. I always tell the truth anyway, but you got the best out of me, and your intelligence is remarkable. Your insight, your senses are dead right. I think I'm a big fan of yours already, and I'm saying you that now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Marty. Okay. See you again. Good luck with everything.
Look after yourself, Steve.
You too. Care. Be careful in that bathroom.
Take care, buddy.
Bye.
Take care. Yeah, take care.
Up there is an interview I recommend. Down there is where you can find all the podcast interviews. And here is where you can connect.